Tuesday. So, this play has been very controversial and has an interesting history of staging and in the movie versions. These signet editions are good because typically you have an essay in the back on the history of productions, and it's worth looking at. Just briefly, there have been two camps about the play. You might say one that says it's pro-war and another that says it's anti-war. That is, for most of its history, it's been regarded as a great patriotic English play celebrating one of the greatest of English kings. And Henry V is a very famous and much celebrated king. He won great victories in France. He was a good guy. He seems to have been pious. So we see in the play he attributes his victories to God. He treats people well. And so he's often been seen as the personification of the ideal British monarch. During World War II, Laurence Olivier chose to do what turned out to be his famous movie version of Henry V, which is a celebration of this great English king made during World War II when England was under threat and facing great trials. And the movie has a great patriotic feel for it, a feel to it. Now, Kenneth Branagh, when he did his movie version of Henry V, was famous for having taken a more negative view of Henry. And I remember when that film came out, it was treated as the first anti-war treatment of Henry V. If Laurence Olivier had produced the World War II version of Henry V, Branagh was said to have produced the Vietnam War version of Henry V. And indeed, there's a good deal in that film that stresses the brutality of war. Actually, Orson Welles had already done that in his curious version of the story, Chimes at Midnight. But there was a debate then, and it continues. What is the view of Henry V in the play? Is he such a goody-goody king, or is he somehow sinister? There are some nasty things he does in the play, like executing his friend, I should say, I guess, former friend Bardolph, and above all, the action to execute the French prisoners, which we'll discuss at great length next time. And people have gone back and forth on this, but I think we're in a better position to appreciate how, in fact, these two views are not incompatible. That is, what we've been seeing is that Shakespeare is aware of the nasty side of politics and how it often involves cruelty at the same time as he sees the necessity of politics and the nobility of it, or at least the potential nobility of it. So it shouldn't seem so strange to us that Shakespeare might portray a good king who nevertheless has to do some very nasty things at times, such as in the middle of a battle when he's vastly outnumbered and his whole army and hence his nation is at stake. So that is the way I will approach it, the play, that insofar as it has a teaching about kingship, it does support some of the good elements of kingship, ordinary virtuous elements of a king, like his ability to administer mercy. On the other hand, it does show that politics is not an easy way of life, and sometimes kings have to do nasty things. And we will see how this whole education of Hal that we've looked at comes to his benefit now that he has become Henry V. All these problems we've been looking at, we will see how he chooses to resolve them, or how he's able to do better as a king than either Richard II or Henry IV was able, so that we will see him dealing with the church and the problem of Christianity and politics. We will see how he deals with nobles and the fact that nobles are always potential rebels against the king. We will see him deal with the common people. And in all these respects, we will see how his educational process has come to help him, how, for example, all that time he spent with Falstaff was not misspent, but that talents he picked up from Falstaff enable him to be a better king. And above all, I'm going to try to stress the intellectual component of Hal, what we can almost call the philosophical component of Hal as Henry V, that there is an aspect to his kingship that takes the form of an intellectual virtue. That's why I pointed to the distinction that Fluellen, in effect, creates between Alexander the Pig and Henry V. Alexander the Pig, who did things in anger and ale, and Henry V, who shows right wits and good judgment. And we will see very quickly how Henry is made in the mold, indeed, of Plato's philosopher king. So let's take up the play at the very beginning. And the opening scene is really a shock. Again, I know of nothing like it. We have two bishops, really the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Bishop of Ely, talking as if they were lobbyists in Washington, D.C. There's a bill before Parliament. They're worried about it. What are they going to do about it? And how are they going to make a deal with the king? This scene is omitted in every production of Henry V I've ever seen. It's omitted in all the movie versions I know of. It is typical. People will question Shakespeare's interest in politics and say, really, he's interested in human nature. He's not interested in politics, as if one could study human nature independent of politics. But then they remove scenes like this, these incredibly political scenes, which deal with virtually nothing but politics, and then they tell you Shakespeare's not interested in politics after they've carved up his plays. So, given what we've seen in the history plays thus far, this scene confronts us immediately with one of the central issues, the issue of the church and politics, specifically the Catholic Church and politics, and we see how powerful the church is and how Henry is already working with them to serve his ends as king. And we learn here there's a bill in Parliament, and the bill is designed to seize the church lands. This is page 5, so Act 1, Scene 1, about line 8. We lose the better half of our possession. For all the temporal lands which men devout by testament have given to the church, would they strip from us? Now, to this day, the Catholic Church is a rather large landowner. It is, for example, the single largest landowner in the island of Manhattan, which is a nice chunk of real estate, by the way. And it has a very nice plot of land in downtown Rome, for example. It's called the Vatican. But in the Middle Ages, the church was far more powerful, far more endowed with land. What we see here is all the lands which men devout by testament have given the church. When people would die, they would will their land to the church in the hopes that that would guarantee them getting into heaven, which the Catholic Church more or less promised to them at the time. And you can imagine if that process had gone on forever, and there'd been no Reformation in England, the Catholic Church might today own all of the islands of Great Britain. This is a very serious threat to the church, an attempt to seize its lands. Now, it could not have been lost on Shakespeare's audience that this is exactly what Henry VIII did in the 16th century. In a way, these plays do point ahead to the way the Tudor dynasty, Henry VII, Henry VIII, Queen Elizabeth, settled the religious problem in England. Because look how the Canterbury goes on here at line 12. Being valued thus as much as would maintain to the king's honor full 15 earls and 1,500 knights, 6,200 good esquires. This is a lot of land, and it would support a lot of nobles who would then be beholden to the king. Now I mentioned this earlier, so maybe it would be in your heads when you got to this. This is exactly what Henry VIII did 1535 when he created the Church of England, broke with Rome and the Catholic Church and the Pope, made himself the supreme head of the Church of England with the ability to appoint the Archbishop of Canterbury, something that the Pope had been doing for centuries. And at the same time, in a classic case of killing two birds with one stone, Henry seized the church lands in England, the Catholic church lands, and used them to create new nobility. And he had a lot of room for that because in these wars we were looking at, a lot of the nobles were killed off and the line would be ended. There are no more Percys. We've run out of Percys by the time these plays are over. So you can create a new aristocratic family of Percys, and Henry would appoint his loyalists to these new noble positions and endow them with lands he'd seized from the church. That was his strategy, and Shakespeare's not making this up, as I'll show you in a moment, but I think he is very carefully pointing ahead to what emerged as the Tudor settlement in the 16th century. So this is a serious threat to the power of the church, and these church leaders here, the bishop and the archbishop, have to deal with Henry, and they feel they can. And we see here now how Henry's strategy, announced at the end of Act 1, Scene 2 of Henry IV, Part 1, has paid off. He said there, I'm going to stage a reformation, and people are going to think I'm the greatest thing in the world. I'm like the prodigal son in the Bible. People love stories of this kind of moral reformation, and the church has bought into it here. Look at page 6. So Act 1, Scene 1, line 24. We hear from Eli that the king is a true lover of the Holy Church. And Canterbury says, the courses of his youth promised it not. The breath no sooner left his father's body, but that his wildness, mortified at him, seemed to die too. Yea, at that very moment, consideration like an angel came and whipped the offending Adam out of him, leaving his body as a paradise to envelop and contain celestial spirits. So of all the audience Henry had in his plan, the Catholic Church has proven to be the best audience. They've bought into this story because it seems like such a religious story. And then we hear the church praising Henry as, I'm going to say, a Renaissance man. When we talk about the Renaissance, we have this term Renaissance man, which is kind of a high-level jack of all trades. We think of someone like Leonardo, who was a great painter and a great inventor and a great scientist and a great engineer and so on. Or Michelangelo was a great sculptor, a great painter, again, a great engineer, so on. And this is what we learn from Canterbury, bottom of page 6, Act 1, Scene 1, about line 38. Hear him but reason in divinity, and all admiring, with an inward wish you would desire the king were made a prelate. Hear him but debate of commonwealth affairs, you would say it hath been all in all a study, listed as a discourse of war, and you shall hear a fearful battle rendered you in music. Turn to any cause of policy, the Gordian knot of it he will unloose. By the way, that compares him to Alexander the Great again, and so on. And we hear this guy can do everything, and above all, he can combine theory and practice. Line 51. So that the art and practic part of life must be the mistress to this theoric. I'm not sure about your note there, which says that this means practice and experience must have taught him theory. I think it may just mean that practice governs theory in his life. But in any case, he's combining theory and practice. That's Plato's philosopher king. We've been talking about how Hal was educated by a Socrates figure in the form of Falstaff. We're going to see this idea the philosopher king, of combining philosophy and kingship, of bringing philosophy and politics together. Very important in Shakespeare. It will come up again in King Lear and above all in The Tempest. And here we see that to the extent Shakespeare portrays Henry V as the great king, as perhaps the ideal king, or as close to an ideal king as can be reasonably expected in human life, the reason behind it would be that he can combine theory and practice. And again, I will keep coming back to the philosophical aspects of Henry in the play. And indeed, now Eli says, line 63, so the prince obscures contemplation under the veil of wildness. These men understand something of Prince Hal's truancy. I said at the time there was, in effect, a theoretical component to Henry's going out among his people. We will see that again in this play, that he wants to learn something. It is a form of the contemplative life to him, though, as you can see, ultimately subordinate to the practical life, to the life of politics. Page 8, we now learn that Henry and the Archbishop have been making a deal behind the scenes. This is page 8, Act 1, Scene 1, about line 75. For I have made an offer to His Majesty, an offer that he can't refuse. There really is something mafia-like about this scene of the church combining with the king. Upon a spiritual convocation and regard of causes now in hand, which I have opened to His Grace at hand as touching France, to give a greater sum than ever at one time the clergy yet did to his predecessors part withal. So this is, let's buy the king off. Rather than have him take all our lands, let's just give him a lot of money right now, which he then can use in his war against France, and moreover, let's supply him with a justification for that war against France. And indeed, line 85, as I have perceived His Grace would fain have done, the severals and unhidden passages of his true titles to come to some certain dukedoms, and generally to the crown and seat of France, derived from Edward, his great-grandfather. Now, it's interesting, here Shakespeare has changed the history somewhat. If you turn to page 138 in the Signet, you'll see that in the chronicle Shakespeare was working from, there's no prior deal between Henry and the church. In the historical account, the church comes up with this idea to save itself. This is the last paragraph on 138. This bill was much noted and more feared among the religious sort, whom surely it touched very near, and therefore to find remedy against it, they determined to essay all ways to put by and overthrow this bill, wherein they thought best to try if they might move the king's mood with some sharp invention, that he should not regard the importunate petitions of the commons. In the history, this is all initiated out of Parliament. Now, Shakespeare does mention Parliament. Again, it's one of the important places where he mentions Parliament. But the suggestion in Shakespeare is that Henry is the moving force behind this bill. And so continuing on page 138 in the Signet, whereupon on a day in the Parliament, Henry Chichely, Archbishop of Canterbury, made a pithy oration wherein he declared how not only the duchies of Normandy and Aquitaine, with the counties of Anjou and Maine, and the country of Gascogne were by undoubted title appertain to the king as to the lawful and only heir of the same, but also the whole realm of France as heir to his great-grandfather, King Edward III. Now, in some ways, you can see how carefully Shakespeare's following the historical account here, but the emphasis is different. In the historical account of Holinshed, the impetus comes entirely from the church to make this deal. It's the church's idea to try to divert Henry from this domestic policy issue of seizing the church lands to foreign policy and getting him to fight against France. The overwhelming implication in Shakespeare is that Henry has conspired behind the scenes with the church to cancel out this bill in favor of a new crusade against France. It's very interesting, the relation between the first scene of this Act 1 and the second scene. It's the reverse of what we saw in Richard II. In Richard II, we got the political appearance first, and then the political reality. That is, in Richard II, we saw this grand public scene on a tournament field, and everybody behaving as if they were out of the pages of the history of King Arthur. And then later, in the fourth scene of the act, we realized what was going on behind the scene and all the political machinations and how much tax money Richard needed and how he wanted to seize the lands of Lancaster and so on. Here, Shakespeare gives us the reverse effect. We see the backroom dealing first, and then we see the grand public scene. By the way, remember this pattern when you get to King Lear. It's very important in King Lear to see the relation between the first scene, which tells us what was going on behind the scenes, and the second scene, which is the big public scene. And again, by omitting that opening scene in King Lear, a lot of people end up distorting our perception of that play. And again, you can see how ridiculous it is that people don't stage this scene when they do the play. They're leaving out something that Shakespeare is very much trying to suggest here about politics, and particularly the relation of religion and politics. Now let's turn to the second scene. So that's page 9. And here we see what a difference a king makes. We've seen that Richard lost the sacred character of the kingship, and Bolingbroke was never able to regain it as Henry IV, having in effect desacralized the kingship by deposing the anointed king. Well, we're now back in seemingly a medieval court here. This is page 9, Act 1, Scene 2, about line 7. Canterbury says, this is the Archbishop of Canterbury, God and his angels guard your sacred throne. And this is what Henry V has labored to achieve. He's learned this lesson from his father. He's learned it in general from his sense that the king must have a sacred appearance here. And, you know, his very first words, line 1 in this scene, are, "Where is my gracious Lord of Canterbury?" We've seen in the earlier part, in Henry IV, those two parts, men like the Archbishop of Canterbury leading a rebellion against the Lancaster dynasty. Now we will see them step forward to support it, and above all to support Henry's crusade, which is not going all the way to Jerusalem, but is just going across the English Channel of France. Much more practical, much more doable, we would say. And, you know, given the first scene, we can see what's happened. Henry has induced this bill in Parliament to threaten the church. The church has made a deal to give him a lot of money and also to give him public support for the war against France. Now, being the wizened up Henry V that he is, bottom of page 8, about line 8, "Sure we thank you, my learned lord, we pray you to proceed and justly and religiously unfold why the law salique that they have in France or should not bar us in our claim." This is very important to give the appearance of complete impartiality. I don't particularly want to invade France, but you're here to tell me whether I have a claim to the French throne, and tell me whether I do or not. And indeed, Henry piles it up here, line 12 on page 9. "And God forbid, my dear and faithful lord, that you should fashion, rest, or bow your reading, or nicely charge your understanding soul with opening titles miscreate, whose right suits not in native colors with the truth." Now, we know how phony this is. The church has made a deal with Henry to support his right to France. But now he's pretending, I'm just Mr. Nice Guy here. I'm just here to listen impartially to what the church tells me to do. And top of page 10, line 18, for God doth know how many now in health shall drop their blood in approbation of what your reverence shall incite us to. Therefore, take heed how you pawn our person, how you awake our sleeping sword of war. We charge you in the name of God, take heed, for never two such kingdoms did contend without much fall of blood, whose guiltless drops are every one a woe, a sore complaint, against him whose wrongs give edge unto the swords, that make such waste and brief mortality. Under this conjuration speak, my lord, for we will hear, note, and believe in heart that what you speak is in your conscience washed as pure as sin with baptism. We know what the background to this is. Henry's pretending, war is terrible. I don't want to get involved in war. And be sure you give me the God's honest truth here. And remember what we said in the backroom deal. And then Canterbury proceeds to explain Henry's right to the throne in France. Now let me pause here and say something about England and France at this time. The reason things are so complicated here is that the English royal family was French during this whole period. Remember the Norman Conquest, 1066. In 1066, a group, William the Conqueror from Normandy, crossed the English Channel and defeated the armies of King Harold, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England. And from 1066 on, from William the Conqueror on, the British royal family was French. We're dealing with a Plantagenet family here, Plantagenet, we would say in France. As a result, the royal family in England owned a lot of land in France, in Normandy, in places like Maine, but also Aquitaine, a little south of there. And the French and English royal families were intermarried, interchanged. John of Gaunt is Ghent, which is now in Belgium, but was then part, I think, of the Duchy of Burgundy. There's all sorts of intermarriage between the royal families on the continent and those in England. Richard II, French was probably his first language. He was Richard of Bordeaux. He was born in Bordeaux. Most likely his court was French-speaking. Geoffrey Chaucer was part of that court. Some of Chaucer's earliest poems were written in French. And in any case, his English poems are often rooted in French poems. I was surprised when I was just looking this up last night. Henry V was may have been the first English monarch for whom English was the first language. He is noted he was the first English monarch whose correspondence is in English, not in French. He was the first English monarch who made English the official language of the court. French was the language of the court and the English court system for several centuries. So again, we think of England and France as very separate now. They were very much intertwined then. I was in France in October, and if you go in the Loire Valley to the Abbey Fontevraud, that's where Richard the Lionhearted is buried. Richard the Lionhearted is buried in France, and along with Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. The English have tried to get the bodies back to bury them in Westminster Abbey, but the French are hanging on to them. But it was very peculiar. You show up at the Abbey Fontevraud, and there are all these famous English, supposedly famous English monarchs, and they're buried there. And so much of English culture was rooted in France. And so, what I'm saying is that Henry had something of a claim to the French throne. Through Edward the Black Prince, who is his great-grandfather. And again, all these English royal characters were of Norman descent and had French connections. And so we get a long speech by Canterbury about Henry V's claim to the French throne. Now, before we examine that, let me point out that Henry's claim to the English throne isn't all that good to begin with here. That's the great irony of this scene, that there's a lot of people in England that don't think Henry V is the rightful monarch. There was this business that Richard II more or less designated Mortimer as his successor, and that would be descent through the second surviving son of Edward III, not, as in Henry V's case, descent through the third surviving son, John of Gaunt. So in any case, in some ways, this whole scene is Shakespeare's marvelous comment on this great principle of legitimacy and succession on which monarchy works. It always seems so simple and attractive. How do we choose our ruler? Well, let the child of the ruler be the next ruler, and then the child of that ruler. But families don't work out that way. We often see there's some kind of interruption in the line. And then we get the question of the descent through the mother or through the father, through the masculine or the feminine line. That's the whole debate here. That the French are saying that the descent must be through the masculine line, and therefore certain people aren't eligible for the throne because they would inherit through the feminine line. Now, the irony is this is the claim that Henry made against Mortimer. Mortimer's descent was through a woman, through the daughter of Clarence, not through the son. And when the Lancaster dynasty stood up for their right to the throne, they said, you can't have descent through a woman. Now they're claiming you can have descent through a woman because Henry's claim to the French throne would descend on that line. Now again, don't worry about the complexities of this. It won't be on the final. But in a way, what Shakespeare is showing us is how confusing these lines of descent are. So we've got this moment here. The French believe the Salic law applies to France. How dare they? We learn from the Archbishop of Canterbury that the Salic law applies in Germany. It doesn't appear in France. By the way, this is when you need a Catholic prelate on your side because the law's in Latin, as you'll see in line 38. And this is why Henry brings in the Catholic Church on his side. They were specialists in interpretation and especially in Latin during the Middle Ages. So we have essentially this preposterous claim that the French don't know how to chart their own line of succession because they don't realize that the law barring succession through the female line applies not in their country but in Germany. Besides that, I won't read this whole speech. And it's funny, in Laurence Olivier's movie, he doesn't know what to do about it, so he turns it into a whole comedy here. And in some ways, it should be comic. Look at line 65 on page 11. King Pepin, which deposed Childeric. Little blip here in the line of succession. There was a deposition here. Look at line 69. You Capet also, who usurped the crown of Charles, the Duke of Lorraine. So we had a deposition, we had a usurpation here. That's referred to again at line 78. And so we learn all these lines are so ridiculously compromised in one way or another. You trace back the lineage of any royal family in Europe, and there's something suspicious in it, and that these lines, which are supposed to produce such wonderful continuity of rulership, they're always compromised by usurpations and depositions and dubious dissent. And so we get this virtually is comic, line 86 in Act 1, Scene 2 at the top of page 12. So that is clear as is the summer sun. We've been getting the verbal runaround in the speech. We can't follow it. We don't know who's succeeding whom. And then, so that is clear as is the summer sun, so on. And then Henry says, line 96, may I with right and conscience make this claim. And then he gets to hear what he wants to hear from Canterbury at line 97, the sin upon my head, dread sovereign. And then he quotes the Bible, for in the book of Numbers it is written, when the man dies, let the inheritance descend unto the daughter. Here's the church substituting its law, the law of the Bible, for the law of France, which of course was the problem throughout the Middle Ages. Why you got the Reformation, one reason you got the Reformation, or why political leaders often supported the Reformation. But anyway, the sin upon my head. We're going to see this as the Falstaffian strategy of Henry V throughout this play. He manages always to put the onus on somebody else. I had no idea of invading France. I never even knew I was the rightful heir to the throne of France until the Archbishop of Canterbury came and told me so. And indeed, we'll see this pattern repeat, that Henry's goal, and it is a Machiavellian goal, is to transfer the public responsibility for what he does to someone else. And indeed, we see how successful, how clever Henry is doing things here, doing things indirectly. He doesn't come up and announce, I have a claim to the throne of France, therefore let's go invade. He stages this very consciously as a public scene so that the Catholic Church has given him the authority. And this is his secret in getting everybody behind him. As page 13, Westmoreland says, so this is still Act 1, Scene 2, line 126, never king of England had nobles richer and more loyal subjects. And that's it. That's the great goal that eluded his father. He's got the nobles behind him. He's got the people behind them. And whose hearts have left their bodies here in England and lie pavilion in the fields of France. And then Canterbury throws in line 133, in aid whereof we of the spirituality will raise your highness such a mighty sum as never did the clergy at one time bring in to any of your ancestors. Just out of the goodness of their heart, with no concern for any bill in front of Parliament, they're going to contribute all this money to the war in France. And then if that weren't enough, the French blunder and give Henry the further thing he needs, a provocation. This ambassador shows up, and no doubt, this is page 17, line 241, very important line that resonates throughout the play, when Henry says, we are no tyrant, but a Christian king. And that's going to be the issue throughout the play. He's not a tyrant in a way that's saying there's nothing Machiavellian about him. He's not a new prince in a new land, but a Christian king. And indeed, you see how he gives the appearance of a Christian king here. The Catholic Church is backing him to the hilt here. Now, the French have been taken in by Henry's ostensibly dissolute youth, and so they insult him. They bring what appears to be a little chest of treasure, and it contains tennis balls. This seems so anachronistic to us, but it's not. I mean, at least for Shakespeare's time, tennis was already a sport. And so they give him the public insult he needs, a provocation. This is page 18. So towards the end of Act 1, Scene 2, how he comes o'er us with our wild, line 267, and we understand him well, how he comes o'er us with our wilder days, not measuring what use we made of them, We never valued this poor seed of England, and therefore living hence did give ourselves to barbarous license, and so on. And then line 282, his soul, the dauphin soul, shall stand sore charges for the wasteful vengeance that shall fly with them. For many 1,000 widows shall this mock out of their dear husbands. So there it is. Henry didn't come up with the idea of the war in France. The Catholic Church did. And Henry didn't provoke a war with France. France, in the person of the Dauphin, provoked a war with England. His soul shall stand sore charged. Henry keeps doing things to make sure his soul will not be charged with these deeds he does. So that's our beginning of the war with France. But before Henry can cross the ocean, he's got a little business, a little kind of mafia business to take care of before he leaves. Look at the prologue to Act 2. So this is page 20, line 1. Now all the youth of England are on fire. Youth has come back. Henry IV, Part 1, began in the youthful world with Hal's youth. We saw how age crept over the kingdom in Part 2, with this sense of everybody growing old. What Henry's done here is to mobilize the youth of England and given a new charge to the kingdom here. And it is the solution to that problem of the nobles that give them something noble to do. That was the problem in Richard II. We saw those spirited men at the beginning of the play, these heroic men, Mowbray and Bolingbroke. They wanted to fight. They were, they're like Hotspur, they're eager for fights. And so they fought each other. And what was dangerous there was Englishmen fighting Englishmen. And indeed, civil war emerged from that. This play shows Henry V learning the lesson Henry IV taught him: busy their minds with foreign quarrels. Let them go fight somebody else. And that is the great hope in these plays, to divert the spiritedness of the English nobility from fighting each other to getting them to fight the French. Back on page 20, line 16, so the Act 2 chorus. O England, model to thy inward greatness, like little body with a mighty heart, what mightst thou do that honor would thee do, were all thy children kind and natural? So that's the hope here, that Englishmen should unite with Englishmen, and how can they do that? Only by fighting with the French. And we see that at a number of points among the lowlife. Now, this play doesn't have as many lowlife scenes as Henry IV Part 1 and 2 did, but Shakespeare knew a good formula, and it's something the audience wanted. So we'll talk in a minute about Falstaff in the play, but we definitely bring back Ancient Pistol and Bardolph. And if you look at page 25, bottom of that page, so Act 2, Scene 1, line 93, once again, we've seen the quarrelsomeness of these lowlives. Indeed, again, we've seen these quarrelsomeness of these English, the effect of thumos with them. They're all getting angry. And Bardolph says, this is line 92 in Act 2, Scene 1, come, shall I make you two friends? We must to France together. Why the devil should we keep knives to cut one another's throats? And that's one of the great political lessons of the play. Why should the English fight the English when they could be all fighting the French? And that's repeated at several points in the play. If you look at page 85, page 80, it comes up again. This is page 80 at the bottom, Act 4, Scene 1. about line 227, Bates says, "Be friends, you English fools, be friends. We have French quarrels enough if you could tell how to reckon." And that redirection of English thumas away from Englishmen to Frenchmen is very much at the core of what Henry accomplishes, why he understands what he has to do to give his people a nice foreign quarrel and give the nobles a chance to strut their stuff and gain some kind of honor in war. And also, as we'll see, there's the promise of the spoils of war and how it might enrich people while they're doing it. So there's one problem, though, before Henry can get going to France, and that's there's treachery. There's still treachery among his nobles. There's a plot against his life. And certainly he must dispose of the potential traitors among the nobles before he can lead the war to France. And he's spied it out, and he's all ready to take action against them. But notice how he does it. Very politically. Turn to page 29. So this is Act 2, Scene 2. King's there. He's actually surrounded by the nobles he knows are traitors. And out of the blue, this is Act 2, Scene 2, line 38. He says, "Uncle of Exeter, enlarge the man committed yesterday that railed against our person. We consider it was excessive wine that set him on, and on his more advice, we pardon him." Now, interesting detail here, again, something of what Henry V has learned from Falstaff. He's as a reigning monarch, he's willing to accept excessive wine as an excuse for treason. This man, whoever he is, has railed against the king. And Henry wants to show how generous and how merciful he is. And, you know, it's all that he learned in the taverns of England, that some people get drunk and they say something they don't mean, and so we shouldn't execute them. And then Scroop jumps in. So this is still page 29, line 44 in Act 2, Scene 2. That's mercy, but too much security. "Let him be punished, sovereign, lest example breed by his sufferance more of such a kind." And then Cambridge jumps in, and Grey jumps in, and all these people who are in fact traitors. And Henry set a trap for them. He has, on a trivial issue, exercised mercy on an insignificant man and gotten these nobles to speak up against mercy and how you cannot be lenient with disloyal subjects. And so when he then announces to them that he knows they're traitors, and they start groveling, as people are wont to do when their heads are about to be cut off. Turn to page 30. So Act 2, Scene 2, about line 79. Henry is now able to say, first of all, Cambridge says, "I do confess my fault and do submit me to your highness's mercy, to which we all appeal." And the king says, "The mercy that was quick in us but late, by your own counsel, is suppressed and killed. For you must not dare for shame to talk of mercy, for your own reasons turn into your bosoms. I'm going to execute you. I'm not going to show you mercy, but it's not my fault. It's your own fault. I was the most merciful guy in town up until a few minutes ago when you taught me that mercy is not a good thing for a king to exercise." It's just wonderful, but again, an example of how he makes everyone else responsible for the things he wants to do himself here. And he really shames them into silence here by indeed showing that they've condemned themselves. Now, very quickly, I'll say a few words about Falstaff in the play. Shakespeare had promised that Falstaff was going to be in this play. It seems to be what the audience wanted, and we don't get him. We just get a narrated death scene. And this has puzzled people, and there are all sorts of debates about this. Some people think this play is a revision, that Shakespeare wrote a play that had Falstaff in it, and then decided to cut him out. Anyway, we'll never be able to settle that issue. Back on page 25, so Act 2, Scene 1, line 991, we learn of Falstaff, the king has killed his heart. And I don't want to minimize the painfulness of that, to understand that Henry is responsible for Falstaff's death. Presumably his rejection of Falstaff at the end of Part 2 has sent the old knight into a depression, and he's now dying of it. And then we do get a narration of his death in Act 2, Scene 3. It's as if Shakespeare's trying to wrap up the fate of Falstaff. It's like, as I mentioned earlier, Arthur Conan Doyle killing off Sherlock Holmes at Reichenbach Falls. He wants to make sure Falstaff will never come back. But it's very interesting that he doesn't show this scene. And every movie I know does. Shakespeare has it only narrated. To have it only narrated, it moderates the emotional force of the scene. It's very interesting to see how in the various movies there's a kind of voiceover, and as you can do in a movie, you can show Falstaff expiring while you're hearing the story of his death. Orson Welles, of course, who plays Falstaff and builds the whole film, his whole film around Falstaff, he doesn't even have the scene narrated. He shows it. It's much more powerful when you see it happening as compared to having it only narrated. Shakespeare seems to have gone out of his way to minimize Falstaff's role in this play. I think the reason is that he's trying to hold up Henry V as a hero, and this is something that makes Henry look bad. I mean, Shakespeare does have someone say that the king has killed his heart. We learn of Falstaff's death. This is there to be part of our total evaluation of Henry V, that he has been responsible for the death of his great friend. But I think Shakespeare tries to keep it contained by having it narrated. Now, I mentioned that this scene bears a curious resemblance to the death of Socrates, which people have noted, and to this day it's a puzzle, but I just will present you with the evidence. It is on the bottom of page 35, so Act 2, Scene 3, about line 24. I put my hand into the bed and felt them, and they were as cold, this is his feet, and felt them, and they were as cold as any stone. Then I fell to his knees, and so upward and upward, and all was as cold as any stone. Now, in Plato's dialogue, the Phaedo, where Socrates' death is the subject, in Benjamin Jowett's translation, we have this passage, and the man who gave him the poison now and then looked at his feet and legs, and after a while he pressed his foot hard and asked him if he could feel, and he said no, and then his leg, and so upwards and upwards, and showed us that he was cold and stiff. It's really curious that Jowett's translation uses upwards and upwards, and Shakespeare has the line upward and upward. Some people think Jowett was remembering the scene when he was translating Plato, because this would be a 19th century translation of Plato. Shakespeare certainly would have read this. Now, to this day, I don't know fully what to make of this. One reason I pursued the notion of Falstaff as Socrates is that I already knew about this happening in Henry V. And anyway, this whole scene is a bit of a puzzle, especially because of the kind of buried quotation from Plato's, but I just call it to your attention, and it's certainly worth thinking about. You may want to talk about in your discussion sections, or I'd be happy to discuss it with anybody afterwards. We now come to Act 3, as we finally get to France, and we see Henry in war at this siege of Harfleur, and Act 3, Scene 1, one of his many famous speeches, and his famous speeches in this play tend to be battlefield rhetoric, calls to war. And so this is page 44, Act 3, Scene 1. Once more into the breach, dear friends, once more, or close the wall up with our English dead. Now, before I go into the speech, turn to page 46, Act 3, Scene 2, and there we see Bardolph saying, on, to the breach, to the breach. This is the sort of thing we've been seeing in Henry IV, Part 1 and Part 2. Again, this comic underplot of the underworld here does echo, counterpoint, parody in the scenes, the heroic scenes with Henry, once more into the breach, and then onto the breach again, or again, still on page 46, line 20, up to the breach, you dogs. Clearly, Shakespeare wants this scene to echo the preceding scene. I think here the parallels are there to suggest the differences, that we see the heroic actions of Henry, whereas Bardolph and Nym and these characters are clearly cowards. Their reaction, this is on page 46, is line 3, Nym says, Act 3, Scene 2, line 3, Nym says, pray thee, corporal, stay, the knocks are too hot, and for mine own part I have not the case of lives. A number of the characters have to step in for Falstaff here and keep up the theme that the better part of valor is discretion. And indeed, the boy at line 11 says, would I were an alehouse in London, I would give all my fame for a pot of ale and safety. There's the reverse of Achilles' choice there. There's the reverse of Hotspur's choice. We can see how ordinary people react to these situations. The heroes like Achilles and Hotspur, they want a short but glorious life and reject a long and safe life. But this boy speaks for most of us when he says he'd give anything to be back in London and safe. Now, Henry can't win battles if that's his attitude, or even with soldiers that have this attitude. So he's there to inspire his men. And this is now back on 44, Act 3, Scene 1. Once more into the breach, dear friends, once more, or close the wall up with our English dead. In peace there's nothing so becomes a man as modest stillness and humility, but when the blast of war blows in our ears, then imitate the action of the tiger, stiffen the sinews, conjure up the blood, disguise fair nature with hard-favored rage. There again are the two moralities we've been talking about since Richard II, the heroic morality of the noble warrior and the ordinary, more Christian morality of people in peace. Here, Henry distinguishes very clearly between war and peace. He basically says there are two moralities. One applies in war and one applies in peace. In peace, there's nothing so becomes a man as modest stillness and humility. That's very Christian. You should be humble. You should be a peaceful person. You shouldn't be aggressive. But in war, but when the blast of war blows in our ears, then imitate the action of the tiger. Stiffen the sinews, conjure up the blood. Disguise fair nature with hard-favored rage. It's interesting that Henry uses the language of disguise there. It's almost as if he's talking about acting, and you see the connection between his genius in this play and his acting ability. He's basically saying there's two roles in life, the role of a peaceful man and the role of a warrior, and you better be able to play both of them. And you can see that you would be able to play both of them better if you were not committed by nature to one or the other. Hotspur is a ferocious man by nature, governed by his thumos, It runs away with him. It would be very hard for Hotspur to survive in peacetime. Did we see that? After the battle, he gets himself in trouble. He's still too angry. He argues with his king. Henry is going to be ferocious when he needs to be, but it will work better when, in some ways, he sees it as disguising his nature. When he's really a peaceful man at heart, but he can give the appearance of a warrior when he needs to. What we see here is a form of detachment, that he does not get completely bound up in either role. He therefore can move from peace to war. That is so difficult for Shakespeare's heroes. Many of his heroes' tragedies turn precisely on their inability to move from the world of war to the world of peace. In one way or another, that's the tragedy of Macbeth. It's the tragedy of Othello. It's the tragedy of Coriolanus. Shakespeare had explored it in Richard III. Richard III, who begins his play talking about this piping time of peace. He can't stand that the Wars of the Roses seem to be over. And he points out, remember he had a crookback, he's not so good at dances. He's great on the battlefield. He hates this piping time of peace. Richard III was Shakespeare's first exploration of the difficulty of moving from war to peace. And again, this is a political problem that recurs again and again. People who have trouble moving from success in wartime to domestic politics and peacetime. Douglas MacArthur was a great example of that after World War II and the Korean War in American history. And so it really helps that Henry doesn't fully commit to any of these roles, that for him in some ways each of them is acting a part. Disguising nature is such a key to his success. Now, he is going to need some ferocious guys in his war, in his battle. That's why he's giving this big speech about it, how we got to act like tigers. So if you need somebody ferocious, get an Irishman. And that's what Henry does in the scene. We're introduced in Act 3, Scene 2. It's almost like a bad ethnic joke to an Irishman, a Scotsman, and a Welshman. And it is an interesting aspect of the play that we are now seeing Great Britain and not just England. It's very important in the play that Shakespeare introduces the four nationalities that he would have associated with Great Britain. And, you know, it is curious that to this day, it's amazing how these nationalities remain within the so-called United Kingdom. Remember, the United Kingdom includes part of Ireland, it includes Wales, and it includes Scotland. And we just had, Scotland almost voted for independence recently. It's actually amazing what a bad job the United Kingdom has done over the centuries in assimilating these nations that it conquered. You know, we hear at the beginning of the play, oh, we got to deal with the Scots before we can go to war with France. The Scots are always invading us, and the English had to conquer Wales and the Welsh. It never fully conquered Ireland. It got united with Scotland only in effect by accepting a Scottish king in the person of James I from the Stuart line. So Shakespeare is very aware of this, and one of the aspects of Henry's achievement is that he is creating a Great Britain here, that he's bringing together the Welsh, the Irish, and the Scottish under English rule to fight the French. And this was certainly still a problem in Shakespeare's day, but it shows the level of achievement that this man can bring these hostile peoples against each other. And we see the hostility, page 50, Act 3, Scene 2. Llewellyn, the Welshman, this is Act 3, Scene 2, about line 121,
Captain McMorris, I think, look you, under your correction, there is not many of your nation. Of my nation, McMorris says. What is my nation? Is a villain and a bastard and a knave and a rascal? What is my nation? Who talks of my nation? He's very sensitive on this issue. Don't talk to me about the Irish. Llewellyn's implying there's something wrong with the Irish. There's not many of your name. McMorris jumps all over it as an Irishman. Now, this McMorris is a minor character, but a very interesting one. This is page 49 now. They've been besieging the city, trying to undermine it, tunnel under it, and they've given up. On line 90, so it's Act 3 to line 90, McMorris says, by Christ's law, 'tis ill done. The workers give o'er, the trumpets sound their treat. By my hand I swear my father's soul, the work is ill done. It is give o'er. I would have blowed up the town, so Christ save me. That is one of those lines that only Shakespeare can write, and is of such genius, and to my knowledge, no one has ever noticed this. I would have blown up the town, so Christ saved me. Here we see the two ethics I've been talking about jammed together incongruously in a single sentence. The heroic, the barbaric, the Homeric warrior, I would have blown up the town, so Christ saved me. I hope you can appreciate the incongruity of that one sentence, that you don't invoke Jesus Christ in the same sentence in which you talk about blowing up people. At least you're not supposed to, if Christianity is a religion of peace. And he keeps bringing up Christ as the person who authorizes what he does. Again and again, there's nothing done, so Christ said. And then back on page 50, line 135, I do not know you so good a man as myself. So Christ save me, I will cut off your head. Now, again, that's not the way Christians are supposed to speak. They're not supposed to take the name of the Lord in vain. They're especially not supposed to do it in the course of speaking of killing someone. So McMorris is a kind of comic parody of the comprehensiveness of Henry V and his great soul. I was talking last time about how Henry V is remarkable in the way he's going to combine classical and Christian virtue. He is going to present himself as a Christian king. I am no tyrant, but a Christian king. He will make many, many gestures in the direction of Christianity in this play. At the same time, he will say, in war, you got to be a tiger. And we've just seen him execute people. He's going to execute Barloff in a minute. These are unchristian acts. They're not completely incompatible with Christianity, but they're a little strange. Henry V's propensity for violence, or as I showed you last time, if it be a sin to covet honor, I am the most offending man alive. That's a very similar sentence to, so Christ saved me, I would have cut off his head. Henry is a little more eloquent and gets around it. What Shakespeare shows here is a basic truth about ordinary human beings. They can carry around the most incompatible ideas in their heads because they don't think them through. I am sure that McMorris, being a good Irishman, is a good Christian. If you asked him if he was a Christian, he would say, by Christ save me, I am. But it's a curiosity of human beings that they can often do with one hand what they're denying with the other, that they can say I'm a Christian but express many unchristian sentiments and do unchristian deeds. And Shakespeare sums it up here in McMorris with so Christ save me, I will cut off your head. This is the kind of soldier that Henry's going to need in this battle. There's going to be a lot of cutting off of heads in this play, and there's a hint, I think, in the play that these other nationalities in the United Kingdom are more ferocious because more barbaric, and they will make better soldiers. Now, it actually is historically true that in the history of the British Empire, a very large percentage of the best soldiers came from Ireland and Scotland. This is even true in the history of the United States, that the Irish and Scottish who settled in Appalachia, the Appalachian Mountains, reminding them most of things at home, have a remarkable proportion, say, of the Congressional Medals of Honor in warfare. In the Anglo-American world, the Scottish and the Irish have been the backbone of the military. Rudyard Kipling's stories about the British in India often turn on this issue. And so we see here something about the English, that they're going to draw upon the talents of the Irish, Scottish, and Welshman armies, and it's going to be a better army for just that reason. Now, we get some sense here of why the English army is going to be successful. By the same token, we begin to see what's wrong with the French and why the French army is not going to do so well. I mean, this play builds up to the famous Battle of Agincourt, which the English won at an enormous numerical disadvantage, something like a 10-to-1 superiority of the French, and we'll talk about how that happens. Henry will present it as a miracle, but Shakespeare includes some hints in the play of why the English will triumph. For one thing, they got these Irish fighting for them, and these guys who are nominally Christian but have this barbaric impulse to cut off heads and to blow up towns. The French, on the other hand, are so chivalrous. Indeed, they are still living in the Middle Ages. I'm going to offer this play as illustrating the conquest of modernity over the Middle Ages in military terms. So turn to page 65. So this is Act 3, Scene 7. And here we see the French, and for one thing we will see the French nobles and only the French nobles. Shakespeare makes a point of showing that Henry presides over a citizen army, an army that draws upon all the people, and as you see, not just the English, but the Irish, the Welsh, and the Scottish as well. When we see the French, it's only the nobles, and they are knights in shining armor. They, in fact, have contempt for their own rank and file in their soldiers. They're not interested in them. All they talk about is the generals and the various nobles. And so turn to page 65, Act 3, Scene 7. What are they talking about? Their armor and their horses. Everything that makes them knights. Chivalry comes from the root word in that is cheval. It's the French word for horse. These knights are associated with their horses. Opening line in Act 3, Scene 7, "Tut, I have the best armor of the world, would it were day. You have an excellent armor, but let my horse have his due." And there we see you talk of horse and armor. And if you turn to page 67, Act 3, Scene 7, line 60, the Dauphin said, "I had rather have my horse to my mistress." That's Hotspur all over again. We've been seeing this chivalry, this knightliness, this courtliness, these great medieval heroes, and it is admirable, and we look up to them, and we love stories about King Arthur and their knights. But we're going to see the defect of this overly chivalric view of the world, where you think that the only thing that matters is your horse and your armor. And of course, it's related to the mistress. And that's then wonderful because we see the connection between the French and poetry. The French are unusually poetic here. Look at page 65 again. The Dauphin talks about his horse, who is Pegasus. It's not an ordinary horse. He bounds from the earth. When I bestride, this is line 15, when I bestride him, I soar. I'm a hawk, he trots the air. The bass's horn is who is more musical than the pipe of Hermes. The French are riding on air. They're on their high horses, we would say. They're losing touch with the earth. They lose touch with the ground of the army, which is the infantry. In fact, Henry even has guys who are underground. They're undermining the city. And here the French are just behaving like knights out of Tales of King Arthur. They're writing sonnets, page 66. So this is still actually scene 7, line 41. This is of his horse. I once writ a sonnet in his praise and began thus, wonder of nature. I have heard a sonnet begin so to one's mistress. Then did they imitate that which I composed to my courser, for my horse is my mistress. Now, there's an association here between chivalry and courtly love, between the whole world of admiring your mistress in poetry that calls a wonder of nature, and the world of these knights in shining armor who admire, above all, their horses. This is the connection we'll start to explore next week when we get to Romeo and Juliet, and in general Shakespeare's comedies. He's going to make fun of courtly love in the same way he makes fun of chivalry here. Together they comprise what was the medieval world for Shakespeare. The world of courtly love and chivalry. This view of politics that it was all poetry and knights in shining armor, and this view of similar view of love as being elevated. Both of those things we'll see criticized. And here the problem for the French is that they are out of touch with military reality. They're going to ride into this battle as knights in shining armor. Historically, they were then mowed down by ordinary Englishmen shooting bows and arrows. I will talk about that next time when we talk about the battle. But basically what I'm trying to get across here is the sense that we see the French are still living in the Middle Ages, where it's all poetic. You just write sonnets to your horse. You have a mistress. They're all these aristocratic nobles. They're pinning everything on their knights. And this was medieval warfare, that the knights could win the battles. I talked about gunpowder in connection with Henry IV, Part 1. This Battle of Agincourt actually was a great victory of English archery. It was the English bowmen who won the battle. We would call it a technological victory, victory in which the modern technology of bows and arrows triumphed over the French, riding out of the Middle Ages into history here. But we will now, almost out of time here, so I'll just say in Act 4 we'll see Henry goes among his people before the battle. He wants to find out what his soldiers are thinking. He wants to bond with his soldiers before the battle. The French think nothing of their common soldiers. They view them as with contempt. They have no interest in them. This battle is going to be won in the trenches, we would say, and Henry knows how to do that, how to get out among his soldiers, and this is where the experience in Eastcheap is going to pay off for real. Remember, Henry said, I can drink with any tinker in his own language. And he puts that into effect the night before the Battle of Agincourt, as he goes out among his troops and finds out what they're thinking. Now, it is very interesting, and this is what we'll explore next time, that he has to disguise himself to do that. That he cannot walk out as Henry V among his troops and talk to them man to man. This is another limitation of politics that Shakespeare shows here. One of those reasons the king gets cut off from the common people is they're not going to speak the truth in front of the king. He's too important. He can have them executed. If you tell him what he doesn't want to hear, you can get in a lot of trouble. Henry knows that by now. He has learned the defects of kingship. He's learned the limitations of kingship. Therefore, he makes this decision. I'll disguise myself. I'll go among the people. Again, I would say this is one of the philosophical aspects of Henry, that he's more interested in the truth than in his dignity. He's willing to go out there, and as we will see, hear his troops say very nasty things about the king, like the king will get himself ransomed and we'll die and we won't know what happened. Most kings don't want to do that. most politicians get into trouble because they don't want to hear the truth and they get surrounded by flatterers. So it's a very interesting sequence in Act 4 that we'll look at next. I got a couple of minutes here, so let me pose any questions on what we've done today. Okay, we do have to vacate so that the people can come in and set up mics. So, fun, yeah, I'm pretty sure we get to Romeo and Juliet a week from today.